Friends, colleagues, comrades, I'm honored to be here with you. Thank you deeply for your invitation. If it's okay with you, I'd like to start by reading a few lines from a poem from Korea because it resonates for me here.
Please.
Has darkness ever been so heavy, so dense and fearful? Just as we are about to be seized with the fear of death, overwhelmed by cold and exhaustion. Although today's world is as dark as pitch, and our hopes grow weak, having lost their way, so long as there is just one chance, glimmer of light, we are not yet finished. I know there is a light in the world that darkness cannot understand. I know there is goodness that great evil cannot understand. A human spirit that barbarism cannot understand. A hope that defeat and despair can never understand, still glimmering. If there is one person alive who will not surrender, they have completely failed. They are defeated. The title of this poem is So You Must Not Disappear, and it's written by a Korean activist poet, Park No-hee. His little book of poems was written anonymously as a factory worker in the 1980s, and it was banned by the South Korean dictatorship. And it sold 1 million underground copies, and it inspired thousands of college students to enter factories and organize. And this worker-student solidarity eventually overthrew the military dictatorship. The poet himself was arrested, tortured, and sentenced to death by the US Quisling dictatorship, but he survived. And I quote this poem because I want to point out the importance, not simply of language, of poetry, of art, but this undefeated spirit, this sumud, that barbarism cannot understand, that can never defeat the human spirit. I'll also share with you a few lines from one of his poets, if you will indulge me. This unavoidable wall of despair will break and burst in the end in rough drops of sweat and blood, as for the sake of our calmly breathing, growing love, our fury, our hope, and unity. So today I'd like to talk about fury, but also about love and hope and unity and solidarity, which I believe is the only way out. I want to start my talk with a little bit of history that my family lived through. My parents lived through the Korean War, which properly should be called the Korean Genocide, because it too was a genocide. At least 1/5 of the population of North Korea were killed, which is why North Korea has always been a strong and powerful ally of Palestine, because it understands what it means to be genocided. Now, this genocide of Korea was officially approved by the UN Security Council in 1950, just as the partition of Palestine was also approved by the UNGA in 1949. At the time, the USSR had boycotted the Security Council, so the Western powers pushed through UN Resolution 82, 83, 84, 85. And 84 specifically allowed the Western colonial powers to create a unified command under the United States using the flag of the United Nations at their discretion. And when the USSR returned to the UNSC and threatened to veto these actions that were clearly genocidal in scope, scale, and action, the Western powers pushed through another resolution, the so-called Uniting for Peace 377A resolution that overrode a potential veto and allowed the genocide to continue. So the bankruptcy of the international institutions and international law started from the beginning. And let's just note in passing that Israel has complied with only 2 UN resolutions. UNGA 181, that's the partition of Palestine, and UNGA 273, which is about the admission of Israel to the United Nations. After that, it has been non-stop violations, over 100 resolutions ignored, violated with total impunity. So much for international law. And of course, the West also imposed a two-state solution in Korea, North and South, in 1945, and it didn't work there either. So we understand the nature of international law and the nature of the international institutions and the way that they are manipulated and designed to serve the imperial powers, and the way that they impose impossible choices on the people who are the targets of this violence, or no choices. Once again, one more story from my own family. At one moment during the Korean War, all the men were being taken away to be shot. And my grandmother had to make a decision. In our house, there was a tiny, tiny place, was a little attic that could hide one person. But she had her husband and her son, and she had to decide which one of these men is going to die. These are unthinkable moments, impossible choices, right? But these are the choices that are foisted on Gazans every single day. Death by starvation or death by shooting. Take your choices. Okay? Leave now or die, or leave and die later. The choice to die or to die. These are the kinds of impossible choices that the West, that US and Israel are imposing on Palestine, to die or to die. And the resistance of the Palestinians to refuse that choice, if only momentarily, is one of the greatest acts of courage the world has ever seen. And the job, the West's job, is to interrupt and to delay and to tackle the executioner as an act of moral solidarity. And it can be done. All of this is well mapped out. We know what the pressure points are. We know what the corporations are. We know which countries are involved in shipping, in supporting, in providing weapons, intelligence, means of death. Just look it up. 19 easy ways to resist the genocide. It's all mapped out. It's essentially targeted BDS and targeted actions. All of this can be done. Now, I don't have to tell you because others have clearly described that Gaza is an imperial project. It's not a single rogue nation with a powerful lobby. It's a single rogue nation that is acting as the executioner and agent and subcontractor to the collective imperial West. The reasons are clear. It has to do with neoliberal failure. It has to do with geostrategic influence. And at the core of it, it has to do with capitalist greed, violence, and the last gasp of a dying empire. And at the same time, they want to pretend that it is not their genocide. They want to commit genocide and disown it at the same time. They want to have their genocide cake and eat it too, but it seeps through anyway. I don't know if you recall this, but There was an American who was harassing a halal food vendor early during the genocide in New York. And he would keep following this food vendor all the time, and he would taunt him and threaten him with deportation and torture. And he said, 5,000 dead Palestinian kids is not enough, is not enough. Now, who was this crazy person? Was he an insane person? No, he was a high ranking US diplomat. He was responsible for the two-state solution. And if this is how they talk in public, can you imagine what they were doing and preparing out of the public eye? The State Department didn't even bother to repudiate his views. They gave some things like he does not reflect the ethics, blah, 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 but they didn't repudiate his views. Let's think of Madeleine Albright. When the US journalist Leslie Stahl asked her about the 500,000 dead Iraqi children caused by US sanctions on the news show 60 Minutes, Madeleine Albright said, and she didn't think very hard, she said, I think it was worth it. I think it was worth killing 500,000 Iraqi children. What could justify something like that? But she didn't even have to think about it. So we have to remember the logic of empire. Genocide is not the exception. It's not an accident. It's not something that reluctantly happened because of some lobby or some rogue politician or some rogue state. It is the norm for imperialist colonialism. In fact, it is the structural mandate of capitalism. Capitalism kills. It kills women, men, children, elderly. It kills entire peoples. Over 3 billion since the Industrial Revolution, according to one conservative calculation. And when it's not killing humans, it's killing hope. It's killing justice, logic, reason, and yes, even imagination. Remember Margaret Thatcher's mantra? Tina, there is no alternative. The 0 degree of capitalist oppression is to suppress the capacity to imagine other possibilities, to imagine the possibility to resist. They want you to surrender, submit, give up. And so that's why I quoted Pak Noe, who says, as long as you do not surrender, they have lost. But that also gets us to activism. And in the West, there are small and valiant pockets of solidarity and resistance. And occasionally, for example, as in Italy and Spain, there are large mobilizations, but they are not enough. Nobody is doing enough. In a genocide, anything short of stopping it is not enough. But we do need to name the countries that are responsible for this genocide: the United States, Israel, Canada, Germany, UK, the Western European imperial states, and the sub-imperial lackeys. My own South Korea's Hanwha Corporation is one of the key collaborators with Elbit. And because those are the countries committing the genocide, the people of the West and their hangers-on are complicit. It is our government. It is our responsibility. Those who say, it's not my government, it doesn't represent me, that doesn't count. That doesn't mean anything, because as long as you're paying taxes and as long as you haven't renounced your citizenship, it's your government. And therefore, you need to do something. But another part of the problem is some people think that Gaza, a genocide, is the same thing as picketing for higher wages. It's not. It's fighting for the very soul of humanity. If Gaza falls, a key part of humanity is extinguished. And so we know what needs to be done. Western activists are just starting to become aware of Palestine, but they don't understand the stakes and they don't understand the importance of organizing in solidarity. For them, to be honest, most of what they have dealt with are, quote, what we call first world problems. This is like not getting your hotel room that you wanted or not getting the flavor of ice cream you wanted. Essentially, your pleasures and desires were not fully accommodated. Okay, these are first world problems. These are things you deal with therapy. But Palestine is not a therapeutic problem. It is not a first world problem, and it cannot be solved by a mindset that has only encountered first world problems, or a mindset that seeks to preserve the structures of the imperial first world and its privileges, powers, pretensions, and entitlements. And this includes the pretensions of international law. Gaza requires dedication, real struggle, real responsibility, real action, not activity, activism, and least of all, self-promotion, self-congratulation, entitlement, but dedicated, coordinated action in solidarity by all people, but especially those in the West who are complicit in the genocide. In fact, what it actually requires is revolutionary change. It requires a dismantling of the capitalist colonial empire and its privileges, powers, pretensions, and perversities, of which genocide is actually intrinsic to it. And it will cost those in solidarity with Palestine something, because it is costing the Palestinians everything. So if you care, solidarity means running the same risks, at least some of them. And I believe that there are people in the West who are capable and willing of doing so. And in the meantime, Palestinians have 3 tasks. Tell your story, get it out there, make sure the West understands, and you tell your story, because if you don't tell your story, someone else will tell your story for you, and they will appropriate not only your experience, but your suffering. Don't let that happen. And the second is for the Palestinians to connect. Don't divide. Don't fight amongst yourselves. The ideology of the ruling imperial elite is divide and conquer. And when you divide yourselves, you've internalized the ideology of the ruling class, the ruling imperial elite. You're doing their work for them. So the key task of the Palestinians is to come together. And the last thing is to resist as best as you can while the West steps up and takes on the actual moral duty that it has to prevent the Palestinian genocide. Thank you.